So we have Voxel Plugin, but why? That's what we're going to talk about in this video. So the main reasons Voxel Plugin exists is to create a terrain that is procedurally generated and can be procedurally deformed and be added to, destroyed, all that kind of stuff at runtime. So the normal terrain, right? You create a terrain and it's just going to be flat, and you can take brushes to it. You can deform it manually, but all of that requires you to manually do all of these things. So the reason voxels exist in this context is to be able to procedurally deform the terrain and procedurally generate worlds. That allows you to create like high fidelity worlds without having to manually place every single thing that's in there. So just for instance, right, if we were looking at this from an Unreal Engine built-in landscape perspective, and we're like, well, okay, you know, we got some little paths going on here, we got some little bumps, we're like, but you know, what if we want the bumps to be higher? You'd have to go back in with a brush and manually go over every single one of these bumps to make that higher. So the power of procedural generation, however, is you can just change it. Like you can see here, you know, the amplitude is the height basically of this noise that we're adding. And we can make that way higher, way lower with just changing a couple numbers in there, right? And now we have this way more dynamic landscape. And what if we look at this and we're like, oh, well, you know, we don't want all of these like, you know, rigid bumps here. Like let's spread those, you know, let's make them more rigid. So then we have this pretty much impassable terrain, but it's super wild looking. Obviously that's not great for gameplay. So what if we make these, roll these out a little bit further? Well, you may look at this and you're like, well, that's still kind of boring. Like, I don't know, this is small. Like, what are we even going to do with this? Well, that's the other beautiful thing about Voxel Plugin is, you know, we can change a couple parameters here. If we go into the landscape, see, now we've made this 100 times bigger, and it's all procedural. And this is where the real like power with procedural landscape generation really comes into play, is being able to make a world that is absolutely massive, but still just be able to, you know, modify it with okay, well, let's you know, change the seed there. So it's like, oh, it's slightly different. And you may be looking at this and being like, well, this is still really basic shit. Like, nobody wants to play on a map that looks like this. And I'd say true. So one of the most powerful parts as far as, you know, procedural generation goes is this little bad boy here. So now we have much more control over how, you know, this landscape looks. We can look at this and we're like, well, let's have some higher mountains. You know, let's make it so they're like a little bit more majestic. So we're gonna scale these up. You know, and now we have huge valleys, huge peaks, and we have this massive landscape that we can control mathematically instead of having to go through and create all of this terrain. So one of the things that you can also do, there's all of these different types of noise. So if we have these ridged purlin nodes on here, right, this creates basically mountain ridges. And now you have, this lower spot over here surrounded by mountain ridges. You're like, well, make this so it's a little more, compact. A little more dynamic, as a character running around on this landscape. You can look at this and be like, oh, okay, this is more like character game scale type looking terrain. Let me make sure this is a camera location. And you can see, running around in the editor, this doesn't look incredibly massive, but this terrain is insanely massive. And that's the other thing is this can scale up to the size of worlds. There's demo projects where they have created a 1-to-1 scale version of Mars in a voxel terrain. Actually, let's just walk through Voxel Plugin's official video release here, and I'll try and elaborate on some of the things that they're talking about here. So, caves is one of, this seems trivial, but you can't make caves inside the Unreal Engine landscape. You can't put holes in it. You can't have anything that is not able to be, a height map. So it has to be able to see Z up. It's the same issue with math, right? If you have a function, you have to, you can't have overlapping lines. So mathematically, the Unreal Engine landscape won't allow you to have overhangs or caves or cliffs or anything like this. So that's why it says volumetric. It's in 3 dimensions. It creates a volume as opposed to just a height. So the other part that it's talking about is non-destructive flow. We're looking here, right? This is not destroying the terrain. If you've ever done 3D modeling, when you do put holes in something, you have to create a hole. And if you want to, delete that, then you have to go back and delete the hole, or you have to add geometry and remove geometry. And it's a giant pain in the ass. So what it's saying here, this being volumetric, is it's seamlessly adding to the volume of this landscape to create these holes and these overhangs. And then if you decide oh, well, I don't like this hole, I don't like this overhang, you just remove the brush that you used to create it, you sculpt back over it. You don't have to go back and start refilling topography and everything on a 3D, which would have been the alternative, right? So if you're creating a landscape or something like that, or you're trying to create caves, you literally have to create that static mesh and then import it into your game. And if you want to change anything, you have to go back into a program like Blender and make a new static mesh with the changes that you want. And that is massively time consuming. So this non-destructive workflow is a huge... PCG is the procedural content integration, procedural content generation. Unreal Engine has PCG built into it now. It used to be, just plugins and stuff like that would use it. And now it's actually integrated into Unreal Engine, and it's integrated into the Voxel plugin landscape generation. And this is another thing. When you create auto materials for landscapes in Unreal Engine, one of the limitations is the fact you have all of these layers and it's sampling those layers 5, 10, 15, 20 different times. So every single pixel that is on your screen, if you're using landscapes with auto materials and triplanar materials, it has to sample that pixel and sort through 30 procedures in order to render it. And the way this Voxel plugin works, you can assign these materials, explicit materials, to different parts of the graph. So you're only running a normal, world-aligned texture, and it's only sampling it for that one texture, that one material. So that makes it so you can create these enormous worlds in a much more performant. This is what I was talking about with the, non-destructive morphology and the non-destructive workflow and everything. These stamps, you can grab things off of Quixel or Fab now and turn them into paintbrushes effectively. If you've ever used Photoshop and set up a custom paintbrush, you get any image and you turn it into a paintbrush. It's basically the same thing with this. Is you take this static mesh and you can turn it into a paintbrush, paint onto the landscape. You can also do this procedurally. You can have these meshes added to move from the landscape in a procedural manner. So, runtime Nanite on the fly mesh generation. One of the issues that with a massive hurdle project, right? You made a landscape and unfill and assign these materials, and then Nanite for the landscape materials. You can't do that with I think any other plugin that does voxels. Could be wrong, but I think this is the only one that is actually tapped into Unreal Engine's code and worked with the Unreal Engine dev team enough to be able to integrate Nanite into a procedurally generated, or as this says, on-the-fly mesh generation. That is an insane technological feat. Being able to create a Nanite-enabled world, literally Mars-sized planet world that still has the same performance as Nanite, and having that same level of detail that you get out of Nanite is insane. So we just talked about some more of the Nanite stuff. Nanite Tessellation. Tessellation went away when Nanite was introduced, and now they've reintegrated Nanite Tessellation into it. And, this automatic material blending. So if you're not aware, Tessellation actually takes this landscape, takes this mesh, and deforms it based off of a displacement map. So instead of having to actually try to procedurally, find math that creates tiny little rocks like this, and then also, large scale rocks, you add the material and it'll actually create all of these fine details via the material. And that's actual geometry that will cast shadows and be able to be interacted with as geometry, as opposed to just applying a flat material to the landscape. You can actually step on these rocks because that mesh is actually deformed via tessellation. And then it's kind of hard to see on this little flyby, but you can see where these actually have different heights. And this one's stretched out a little bit. You can see just to, demonstrate it. But you can see that this is all fine detailed geometry. Add all of this tiny things to a small world. But trying to add all of this to a planet the size of Mars, Earth, would be impossible. And this makes it so you can make these materials and procedurally deform the mesh through the tessellation. Lumen support's another huge deal, right? One of the issues with some other plugins that have been able to create caves is you can see the sun through the material because of the way that the occlusion and everything works. So having this runtime generated distance fields, being able to look down into a dark cave and it be dark and not have the, point light, sunlight, that atmospheric light being transmitted through the material, because the material, right, is one directional. So light coming up through most materials, most landscapes, doesn't stop the light. So being able to create these dark caves that you can go into during the day is, a function of Lumen and the world generated light. Being able to sculpt an editor, that's what you can normally do with an Unreal Engine landscape, right? You have to sculpt it or use like a height map or something like that. So this gives you all of the same advantages of the Unreal Engine landscape. But the other thing that is huge is being able to sculpt your terrain at runtime. So that's one of the major things that sets apart, a voxel landscape or a voxel world from, a normal landscape world or, a static mesh built world, is being able to deform it. So like Minecraft, you can dig into the ground, you can create, piles of dirt. So when people look at this and they're like, oh, sculpting at runtime, it's like, well, who really cares about like, oh, I want to sculpt a mountain in my game? Well, that also goes down to small scale. So people can take a shovel, in a survival game or something, and flatten out a landscape to put their cabin on, or, they can build an entire mountain, depending on what you're doing. So the being able to do that at runtime is huge. Another thing that, there's plugins for Minecraft, for instance, to be able to put splines in Minecraft and then create, spherical volumes or like little streams and stuff like that. Being able to create these 2-dimensional and 3-dimensional splines to deform the terrain, and like you're about to see here, actually go through the terrain to create spline-based caves and rivers and streams and all sorts of other things. Super. And I already went over this part, being able to use material painting again. That's built into the Unreal landscape. And this is insane. Right? This is not trickery. This is actually, and you can see it, like, which is why it looks a little funny the way that it is. You can see that this is procedurally generating distance meshes based off of how close the camera is to this planet. Like, that's actually a planet created in the engine. You can run around on that planet full scale. You can see that planet from any distance full scale. You can't do that with anything else. Obviously, if you're a coding genius, you can do all sorts of things to Unreal Engine. If you have a massive dev team to dig into the C++, you can do all sorts of things to the Unreal landscape. You can open up a bunch of different functionality, but most indie devs don't have the time or knowledge to do that. So this is just a plugin, like any other plugin on the marketplace. Like I already showed how it's installed. You don't have to set up, massive amounts of code. You don't have to compile a bunch of things to enable, like, just sort of hack functionality out of the engine itself. This runs on top of the engine without any modification. Oh yeah, so this is another thing that's huge for plugins in general, right? This actually has support. Like I'm on there, most of the whole dev team is on there. And then there's a ton of people who are also making like content for 1.2, like Quad mentioned. they're on there, and there's a ton of people using this plugin, asking questions, solving problems, and it's an active community with hundreds or thousands of people. And if you have this crazy plugin, you have this crazy bit of code, and you send it out into the wild and there's no support for it, you see it all the time. So many mods just get pushed out there, and then nothing happens with them, and you're just left to fend on your own. So that is why Voxel plugin. That is why to use this plugin. That's why to use voxels in general. Even if you don't use this plugin, if there's some other functionality that you think you want that you can get out of a different plugin, that's fine. Voxel plugin just has so much more robust tool set than any other plugin, and look, it's these things are massive and procedural, and all of these advantages. If you have any other questions, drop a comment down there and we can, talk about it. But if you're trying to put holes in a landscape or do procedurally generated landscape, those are the two main things. Like, other plugins do it better or worse, mostly worse, but having all of the different functionality of Voxel plugin and what it has to offer can't be found anywhere else. So that's why Voxel plugin. And I will see you in the next video.